Welcome to another episode of the CPG Guys podcast. Our hosts, Sri Rajgopalan, Peter V.S. Bond, and Brian Gildenberg explore how brands and retailers engage consumers in an increasingly digitally driven world. And now, here are the CPG Guys. Hello and welcome to the CPG Guys podcast. I'm PVSB, and when I'm not co-hosting this podcast along with my partners, I work at Flywheel Digital, where I help enterprise brands improve their SEO and SEM, growing their e-commerce business. Along for our conversation today is my fellow co-founder of the CPG Guys. Please listen to his elder daughter, Ria Raj, music, and she can be found at riaraj.com. Link in the liner notes of this episode. Follow his younger daughter, Lara, on her journey as a founding member of the Cat's Eye Girls Band, which is part of the Hyde Geffen Records incredible competition that took place earlier this year. And her new album is debuting in just a couple months in June. Let me welcome my podcasting ride or die sidekick. He is the man known as Sri. Sri, hey, welcome back from Las Vegas. How was the big game, man? Did you have a good time?
Game was fun, Peter, as always. Las Vegas was busy, too much going on. And I think we've now established that Brady's not the only GOAT. That was fun to see, kind of live in action. But Las Vegas, as you know, is a crazy place. You and I get there for Shop Talk and for Grocery Shop on CES. Nothing's really changed. It was triple as busy as Grocery Shop or even CES. The city was overwhelmed. Way too much going on.
Sri, you buried the lead there. You made mention of the fact that Shop Talk's coming up, and guess who's going to be there in force? The CPG Guys. This is going to be big.
The question of the day, Mr. Bond, are you going to be there?
We're working on it, Sri. We're working on it.
We're doing a wild card game on that one. We're taking Vegas odds. The over-under on that is a week.
Exactly. But anyhow, Sri, glad you could join me today. We've got a really interesting conversation with someone who talks about doing things for good in the industry and benefiting consumers. So I know it's going to be a really fascinating exploration. But before we get to our guests, we want to ask you to help spread the word about this community we've created in the CPG Guys. Beyond sharing our podcast with your friends and colleagues, if you're using Apple Podcasts or Spotify as your preferred listening platform, please, really seriously, hit pause after I finish my next sentence. Please leave us a rating, as it helps feed the algorithm that makes our podcast more findable by CPG retail people like you who are looking to be both educated and entertained. So what I'm going to ask you to do is pause, toggle back to the actual episode on the app, and actually go down and give us a star rating. Now, you can give us whatever number you like. Sri, what's your favorite number? I don't know. What could it be? It's 5.
See a full hand over here. It's got 5 fingers on it.
I like 5. That's my favorite number. But ultimately, it's up to you all. But please give us a rating so other people can find us. It's very important. We're also very happy that the CPG Guys is part of a very impressive collective of highly rated podcasts, including Fast Forward, hosted by Brian Gildenberg, the third CPG guy, CPG Scoop with Risa and Jennifer, and of course, across the pond, the FMCG Guys, which is just exploding in terms of its followership. I mean, they are hot. Sri, I am amazed. But that's hosted by Daniel Afrain and Christine. So please check it out. It gives a little bit different perspective. And my God, the lineup of guests that they have had lately, Sri, it's a who's who of the CPG retail industry.
Peter, I got to pay a little bit of compliments here to Daniel. I met that guy 7 years ago when he was recruiting me maybe 10 years ago, prior to my joining Johnson & Johnson for a role. We stayed in touch. Next thing you know, they called us and started a format for Europe. And he has done an excellent job, very personally, of finding the right guests, learning our blueprint, and then bringing it to Europe. My hat's off to Daniel Efrain.
I'm learning from him now.
For creating them.
I'm watching the stuff he's doing, and he teaches me. Like, I feel like I'm Obi-Wan, and he's come up to me in that battle in Star Wars, and he says, I was once but the learner, now I am the master. Not as nefarious, though. Daniel is a wonderfully good guy, but I feel like he is really on fire with this podcast, the FMCG Guys.
I'm going to need your help to start moving your film references to the 2000s from the 60s, 70s, and 80s.
Sri, I don't know if I can do that.
You're giving away what our generation is. Like, we need to move to like our kid generation.
The last actual album I either bought physically or downloaded on MP3 was, I think, a John Mayer album from 20 years ago. Like, my musical repertoire pretty much ended after John Mayer.
Wait, you're not downloading Ria Raj?
Well, I mean, I'm talking about it full on albums. Her songs are awesome, but I'm not. It's like, how every time Sting or Billy Joel comes out with a new album, I would get it with first date. Don't even need to listen to a song. The days of albums are long gone. Now it's all about singles. But in any event, finally, I just want to say we're incredibly proud of our allyship with Next Up, formerly known as Network of Executive Women, whose mission is to advance the cause of women in business and promote gender equality in the workplace. Next Up has terrific educational and networking resources available to its members. And of course, Shri serves as a director of Next Up. Links to our podcast, the sister podcast we mentioned, our landing page on Next Up, and the social media profiles of Shri's performing artist daughters, Rhea and Lara. They can all be found in the digital liner notes of this episode. There's a lot. You got to start checking out the digital liner notes. There is so much content. Some people just like put a sentence in their episodes. We max out every single character that Apple Podcasts lets us use. And we got lots of hyperlinks. You will find just a wealth of knowledge and information by going to the digital liner notes of this podcast. All right, so let's get our conversation going. If you've ever been in the market to purchase, say, consumer electronics or appliances, and frankly, who hasn't, then you're most likely familiar with the work of today's guest. While we are now accustomed to the crowdsourcing power of user-generated content in the form of ratings and reviews to help guide our purchase decisions, in the world before retailers like Amazon, and frankly, in today's world, when we're talking about very high value purchases, right? The leading source of confidence around product efficacy and safety, it really comes from an organization known as Consumer Reports. Our guest today spent over 6 years at Consumer Reports, primarily as the, ready for this, Shri, Chief Scientific Officer. Boom. He's a graduate of Amherst College. Now, I'm not going to hold that against him, right? Shri, you know where I went to undergrad. I went to Wesleyan. So I'm going to just let that slide. But, some famous grads who went to Amherst, Clarence Birdseye and Charles Merrill of Merrill Lynch. And they were actually roommates at the Chi Psi fraternity right there on campus. Talk about famous graduates.
Peter, I don't think I can compete. I went to Virginia Tech.
Hokies. But in any event, after Amherst, he pursued a PhD in physics from the State University of New York at Stony Brook, and of course, an MBA from the Wharton School at University of Pennsylvania. Man, this is some bona fides here. He's actually taught, not only has he attended academic institutions, he taught physics at both Brown University, now I'm counting like 2 Ivy Leagues and 1 little Ivy, and Vanderbilt. And now he's a strategic advisor for AMTIL, an interactive learning platform for aviation maintenance students. He's here to speak with us about who should be responsible for safety and harm in the consumer marketplace. Please join us in welcoming to the podcast Dr. James H. Dickerson. James, welcome. How you doing?
Good day, everyone. Thank you so much for having me on the show. I'm doing well. I'm really excited for the conversation we're going to have.
Well, James, we're really happy to have you here today. We appreciate you making time to speak with us about how consumer advocacy plays a role in our product development and consumption behaviors. Before we get to our question, why don't you start with just a high-level overview of your current professional areas of focus?
As you described in the intro, I've been in a multitude of industries. In academia, I've worked for the government for a number of years. And most recently, I worked as a consumer advocate and at a independent product testing laboratory. Throughout that entire career, I've lived by the mantra, by sort of the guiding principle of using science to do good. And so everything that I've done, from investigating nanomaterials and leading research efforts in that area, particularly for energy-related sciences, all the way to trying to introduce thoughts and guidance associated with product safety at Consumer Reports, my guiding light, that North Star has always been trying to use science, be it physical sciences, physics, chemistry, be it data science, be it any type of logic to impart good on society. And using those principles, those disciplines I learned in the sciences to ensure that every single person on Earth, but more perhaps not so altruistically kind of up in the air, but more centered, everyone within my community in the United States had an opportunity to live as safely and as they wished to live based on data information that they had at hand.
All right. Well, listen, James, thank you for that mantra and that overview. In the digital liner notes of this episode, we're going to include a link to your LinkedIn profile so our listeners can actually toggle over and read and learn a little bit more about you as we go through this conversation. Now, Sri, I don't know about you, but I'm fairly confident that when we're done with this, I'm certainly going to be able to say that James blinded me with science. Sorry. Again, back to my 1980s music genre, right? So let's get to the question, shall we? James, why don't you start by walking our audience through some of the pivotal professional experiences in your career that have kind of led you to what you're doing now?
So I would say there have been 3 phases of my career, and you could say that those have been quite pivotal in the trajectory that led me to where I am now. So my first job right out of college was being a high school teacher. And so being a high school teacher and then a little bit later on being a college professor really infiltrated my understanding that having information and giving people techniques to use information as effectively as they can, not just for their professional lives, but for their personal lives, was really something that I didn't learn in college, but I knew was going to be essential for my own life and the lives of people that I cared about. And so if it was important for me and it was important for my family and friends, I would imagine that it might be important for the rest of society. So those 2 experiences really set forth the rest of what I end up doing, using this guiding principle of using science for good. The second major phase of my life was working for the United States government. I worked for the United States Department of Energy. And there I did 2 different things. Both, you could say, also followed this guiding principle of using science for good. And so my main job was to try to partner with different academic institutions, with different companies, industrial companies primarily, as well as other national labs, to help them elevate their own ideas, their own technologies into things that you could find on the shelf or you could purchase, not just as a consumer, but as a company. And so that was a way to try to elevate domestic knowledge and technology development in ways that helped our infrastructure. Concurrently, I worked on my own energy-related nanoscience. And so I focused specifically on the development of what are called supercapacitors. You don't need to know what they are, but what they're important for is providing very short bursts of energy that you might need in satellites. If you want to steer a satellite very precisely, you need to have a short burst of energy to change the direction of that satellite. Or you might need a short burst of energy for an electric train to get up a hill that's at a 5 or 6% incline. And so I saw my work there trying to, again, promote infrastructure and make society better than it was before I arrived. Again, same mantra. And then the third and most recent pivot point, if you will, is my time at Consumer Reports. that had perhaps the most direct engagement with everyday people, with just the average person that was trying to make sure that their toaster actually toasted toast and didn't burn it. They wanted to make sure that their automobiles were safe to drive. The car seat in the back of the automobile was safe and protective of their children. The insurance that they were buying for said car, the insurance agencies weren't overcharging them for no good reason other than they lived in a certain zip code. Trying to do, again, using science, using data science, to ensure that society was as good as it could be based on, in this case, the consumer marketplace, consumer goods, products, and services. So those three different experiences, which if you looked at them side by side, you would say there's absolutely nothing related between doing nanomaterials research and trying to make sure toasters work properly. You would say there's nothing related to that. But if you look at it under the lens of trying to do science for good, not only are they related, they're arguably the same thing.
I'm going to say, what a fun job in leading consumer reports at some point in your career, and a great overview there of why it actually matters, because it touches everyday life. But I'm going to go a little bit deeper here and ask you, in that journey as Chief Scientific Officer at Consumer Reports, you must have found a million things that you agreed with and a million things you didn't agree with personally. So can you pick one of your most memorable experiences and tell us one of the things you actually enjoyed during your tenure there as Chief Scientific Officer at Consumer Reports?
So there's one experience that stands out well above the rest. And I've done a lot, and I've really enjoyed my experiences there. There was one campaign that I joined mid-swing. It was roughly a 12-year campaign to try to make furniture safer. I'm sure all of you have heard about the very tragic incidents over the last decade or two about furniture, particularly dressers. Clothing storage units is the technical term, but dressers is what most people think of. Tipping over and falling onto people, usually children, but it's actually happened to people of all ages, literally every single age band, and either injuring or killing them. And so I was heavily involved with my colleagues at Consumer Reports, as well as many within the entire consumer marketplace, manufacturers, retailers, designers, other advocates, to get something called the Sturdy Act passed. It was a piece of legislation that had been bounced around within Congress for a number of years and eventually got over the finish line, in part because my team and I worked on providing data about what intrinsically makes a dresser stable and what features might make them unstable. That was extremely emotional. I mean, I'm a physicist, right? Like, what's the emotion in physics, right? But that was an extremely emotional period of time because not only did I learn that you can't tell whether a dresser is going to be stable just by looking at it, but you also can't take 4 different major characteristics about a dresser, be it just height or weight or some of the dimensions, and then determine whether it's going to be stable or not. Through our data analysis, through statistics, as well as a lot of physics, we learned that it takes at least 5 major characteristics to have any indication of whether a dresser is going to be stable or not. And so what we learned was that no consumer going into a store will have any idea of whether a dresser was stable. And what we also learned was that many of the designers and manufacturers also couldn't predict whether a dresser would necessarily be stable just by the dimensions, just by the design, just by the characteristics that you would see just by looking at a finished dresser. And so throughout my 6 years at CR, we spent a lot of energy not only trying to get the Sturdy Act passed, but we spent a lot of energy working hand in hand with manufacturers, with retailers, with other standard setting organizations to educate ourselves about what things we had to think about to ensure that dressers and other pieces of furniture, when they end up in the marketplace, are intrinsically stable. You don't have to do anything else to it to make sure that they don't fall over on a user. That by far is the most impactful thing I've done perhaps in my entire career.
In my eyes, it's the ability to actually put your learnings into the everyday marketplace that consumers use. I have a curiosity question. I won't ask you details, but just like a yes, no. Does that mean you had to work with Congress and you were actually at our nation's capital often having these conversations?
I spent a lot of time in the belt talking to the Consumer Product Safety Commission, engaging certain legislators that really saw this as a serious issue and put it at issue 0 for them, not issue 1 or 2 that we'll get to, but really issue 0. Representative Chatsky has really been a champion for the Sturdy Act and has done a lot to get that over the finish line. I spent a lot of time in the DC area helping things get moving.
So, James, this kind of makes me think about your dealing as you communicate all of these findings to Congress, to the general public, right? There are going to be skeptics, there are going to be opponents, there are a lot of challenges. Like, how do you navigate the balance between scientific rigor and actually communicating the findings that you've developed to the general public?
It is an extremely challenging endeavor, but I can cite being a high school teacher as being the way that I learned how to do that. And this is indirect, if not direct, shout out to K-12 educators. We got to support them because they do really an onerous job trying to make sure that our children have at least some bits of information and some understanding of how the world works. It's extremely challenging. What I've found is that sometimes the practice is easy because you have people that are receptive to learning or just receptive to information. The more challenging part is when you can't see eye to eye or ear to ear the person to whom you're communicating. And so you basically have to come up with an explanation or an idea or a factoid that can stand not only by itself, but can stand the test of time because you don't even know when they're going to hear it or see it or engage with it. It could be tomorrow. It could be 20 years from now. And so high school teaching taught me how to come up with 10-second, 20-second little nuggets that don't tend to go in one ear and slip out the other, but have little spikes on them that get retained, that get stuck somewhere that people can ruminate on and really chew on and hopefully digest. So big shout out to high school teaching because that's where I learned how to do that. And then later on, being a college professor, a lot of training, a lot of refinement. And then lastly, at Consumer Reports, I had a substantial amount of media training where I had to learn how to look straight into a camera and field questions that were from left field, right field, outer space, and keep a straight face and respond to them in ways that, didn't make me look crazy. It's a challenge.
I gotta imagine that couldn't have been easy because I'm sure as a human, you too have emotions and you too pass judgment. Wrong, right is a different debate for another day, but you too pass judgment on things that happen and how decisions are made, not just by Congress, by brands as well, right? So I'll move on to the next one. And James, what I'm curious about is you referred to at the head of consumer reports a memorable moment being the dresser and the safety around it, etc. But now I'll come out of the memorable world and go to the most significant achievement world. And in your tenure there, if there's one thing you could recall as your single sole most significant achievement in advancing consumer awareness and safety, what would you pick?
So that's a really good question. I would say there are two, and there are two because they're not really related. One is behind the scenes that I think the CPG Guys audience would appreciate because it's much more of a business endeavor. And then one is much more forward facing that everyone can relate to because it is more of a humanistic issue. So the behind the scenes one was that I championed and really helped lead the development of an artificial intelligence project at Consumer Reports, something that's still ongoing, that allowed us to use a segment of artificial intelligence called natural language processing. And so that NLP, or natural language processing endeavor, scanned publicly accessible data, from the government, from state governments, as well as federal governments, as well as data from social media, and tried to pick out hazards and harms that existed in the marketplace that hadn't yet gotten above the noise and become news. And so we were able to identify, once we got started, a multitude of hazards that ultimately led to 4 different recalls. And so just kind of bootstrapping, using people that, oh, I'm doing something else and I'm going to try to work on this NLP project in the little bit of time I have, that over a number of years led to 4 different recalls. And so that's something that I think if others in the marketplace could invest some energy, some time thinking about, the marketplace would be substantially safer. But actually, if I want to talk to you about numbers, it actually ends up being cheaper. And I'm happy to talk to anyone about how having an understanding of what's going on in terms of hazards would ultimately make things cheaper for an organization, be it a retailer, be it a manufacturer, even a designer. I'm happy to chat with you because there's a lot that can be done in that space. So that's the behind the scenes one. The one that's kind of up front is efforts I did within the first year and a half of my tenure at Consumer Reports, which was pool safety. And so that came straight out of high school physics. So there was a period of time in the late teens, 2000 teens, where there was a campaign to have public pools, to have the lifeguards associated with public pools sit right at the edge of the pool. And the logic was, well, if they're right at the edge of the pool, it's so much faster for them to jump in and rescue someone. And so I spent a number of months trying to explain, and then ended up, through some pulling of strings, ended up on network television explaining that that was one of the worst ideas ever. It was awful. And I explained, I understood the logic behind having the lifeguard right at the edge of the pool. But in fact, if you're at the edge of the pool, there was some fraction, if I remember correctly, it was 20% of the entirety of the volume of the pool that was completely invisible to someone standing 6 feet right at the edge of the pool. And so that was the reason why you needed lifeguards to be at 12 or 15 feet sitting up on those lifeguard stands, because at that height, they can see the entire volume of the pool. And it's basically a simple physics law called the law of refraction. So I remember to this day talking to pool safety experts and them thanking me because I was able to, unlike many of them, I was able to get on national TV and say, look, I understand, parents and families and municipalities, why you want to do this, but in fact, it will lead to more tragedies than you can ever imagine. So those are the two perhaps most impactful kind of things that I've done.
Wow. How about that? Using natural language processing to source publicly available information, user-generated content by social media is, at the end of the day, user-generated content to identify sentiment in the form of identifying hazards, right? To try and solve problems for products. That one is absolutely phenomenal. I want to remind our audience that today we have the distinct pleasure of speaking with Dr. James H. Dickerson. He's the former Chief Scientific Officer at Consumer Reports. So you open the door around AI as an emerging technology. So let's walk through. How do you approach incorporating and philosophically incorporating emerging technologies into your testing methodologies? Like, what told you in that case that, maybe this will actually work? I'd love to kind of get your approach to trying to take all of this innovation that's going on in the general industry and commerce, and how does that kind of fit into building better testing methodologies?
That's a great question. So I had some experience working with folks in machine learning while I was at Brookhaven National Laboratory, which is a Department of Energy lab. So I had some background in that and also did my own data analysis work as a nanoscientist. So it was something I had in my background, but it wasn't something that I thought readily could be applied to the consumer marketplace. So when I joined Consumer Reports, I was very fortunate to have as a colleague a theoretical chemist who worked in consumer marketplace. And she very quietly was working on this project. And so partnering with her, and because of my title, I was able to draw out some resources to help her take this really tiny idea and turn it into something real. But introducing new technologies, be it new technologies for product testing, be it ways to retain data and use it for different ways, for any organization, and particularly storied organizations, historical organizations, is a challenge. That's why there's an industry that we all know about called change management industry. And Consumer Reports, the Department of Energy, universities are really no different in having to demand assistance to make those changes with emerging technologies. Because I come from nanoscience, which is an emerging technology, yes, people might think it's old hat now because it's won the Nobel Prize twice in physics and chemistry. I may not be really up to and supportive of emerging technologies, but I'm actually 100% behind. If a technology can help you solve your problem, by all means, go after it, employ it, exploit it, so that it can make you go from step one to step two in a positive, efficient, time efficient, resource efficient manner. But it's extremely difficult. And I've run into those types of obstacles and had to rely on experts in change management to facilitate those transitions.
I like that you kind of said if a tech can actually help you solve a problem, by all means proceed and exploit it. As the world turns and evolves over here, consumer advocacy organizations, different from the organization you work for, which is Consumer Reports, what role do you see these advocacy organizations playing in shaping industry standards and regulations? And did you frequently interact with them in that role?
consumer advocates of different types are needed more now than ever before. The marketplace not only is expanding so that the marketplace is, to my mind, is essentially one marketplace. We no longer have a marketplace in the United States and then one in China and one in Brazil and one in Italy and one in Cote d'Ivoire. It's one marketplace. And so because the marketplace is comprised of the entirety of the human population and the entirety of businesses around the world, advocacy, be it a formal advocate or be it organizations that essentially advocate for standards, advocate for certain perspectives, advocate for the entirety of the marketplace to grow and strengthen and be more robust, I think they're more important than ever before. And there are a couple different organizations. I'll say that they're just organizations, but some of them are explicitly advocacy organizations with whom I've worked that have been really brilliant, and I've really enjoyed engaging them. Everything from a government organization like the Consumer Product Safety Commission, my engagements with them have been really fantastic. I've also engaged the Food and Drug Administration for food safety issues, the NIH for healthcare and health-related issues. I've had very deep engagements with all three of those agencies. But then you can go to other organizations like ICFSO, which is the International Consumer Product Health and Safety Organization. I've had deep interactions with them, and that's really a magnificent organization that if you're not familiar with them, please go to their website, ICPHSO. Just Google them or Bing them. You'll find a lot more about them. ICRT is International Organization of Consumer Advocates, and Consumer Reports is one of the, I think, founding members of that organization and has worked with them for a number of years on trying to ensure that the marketplace globally is as safe and as efficiently working for consumers and retailers and manufacturers as possible. That's the one thing. Let me take one step aside. That's the one thing that I think a lot of people presume about consumer advocates, that their advocacy is only for consumers against others. But that's really not the case. We might have as a focus trying to help the average person, the person who's buying things. But in fact, my philosophy and the philosophy of these organizations is that the marketplace is comprised of all different sorts, and that for the marketplace to get better, all of the different sides have to improve and be healthy. And so I gave you a couple: ICFSO, ICRT, ASTM is another standard, volunteer standards setting organization that really has done quite a lot to help consumers. I would say those are the ones that I've really spent a lot of energy working with and have a lot of good things to say.
So, James, as we think about all the things that Consumer Reports could do to tackle safety issues, it's a pretty big world we live in, and it's got a lot of products. So how did you go about prioritizing the testing and evaluation of products to address what were the most pressing concerns? Did you have a particular rotation that you would work on? Like every other year, we're going to do these types of equipment, and how did you think about doing that, and how did that evolve over time?
So I'll speak only about safety investigations because of the time limit. Just the comparative product testing is a very long and involved process. So to assess what products we would investigate via safety, we would take the data that we had collected internally about what products are the most popular categories, be it noise canceling headphones or air fryers. And then we would look at the publicly accessible data associated with injuries, deaths, even nuisances with those products, and do a data merge. And then would rank every year which product categories were the most dangerous, be it injuries or deaths. Once we had that ranking, we would then match that with things that you just mentioned, Peter, regarding how frequently have we written articles and done stories about these? What is the life cycle for these types of products? Because some products, new products come out every 6 months. Some products come out with a greater period, maybe once a year. Some products are once every 3 years. And so we would make every fiscal year an assessment of what would be the appropriate cadence for our reporting, and then match that with initiatives on the product testing side that might be emergent. Say, there was an example of drones that we started testing, and we found some information about some of the hazards associated with drones. And so we matched up our investigation on the hazards of drones so that we would have product testing stories, and then shortly thereafter, information about the hazards associated with drones. And so that was quite a large orchestration, trying to build out those calendars per fiscal year and then per 2 or 3 fiscal years out. But it always started with data. It always started with the availability and the propensity of those products to be purchased, and then what was the associated hazard. And hazard took precedence over the sales, but we tried to balance them so that we didn't write a story about a product that only sold 10 units, but was particularly hazardous because those 10 units were only sold in one store in one location in a remote part of the country. And so that was a perpetual balance that we would have to look into really quarterly, just so that we were timely and made sure that safety was at the forefront of what people could understand, take in, and make informed decisions for themselves.
Yep, no debate. Safety should always be at the forefront of any decision making, especially in the world that you have touched for so long, James. And so here, the CPG guys, the last question we usually ask is called fast forward. And so I'm going to ask you to fast forward and share any insights that you already are aware of, you see shaping in the industry into the future of consumer advocacy and the role of ones that you've done in your past life as a scientific officer of the consumer advocacy group in shaping this future of consumer advocacy. Is AI relevant?
You hit it. Natural language processing, image processing, it's already revolutionizing the consumer marketplace. And if you don't realize it, then you're already behind the game. The challenge, I think, is that, I've talked about the consumer marketplace having different facets to it. Consumers, retailers, etc. Only a few parts of the consumer marketplace are aware of how important AI is and have already started investing, if not investing for 5-10 years. The ones that are behind the game, and one of them is consumers themselves, will be at a gross disadvantage, to my mind, if consumer advocates don't accelerate and use various forms of AI to facilitate their advocacy. I would say manufacturers can very much use AI, not just natural language processing, but there are whole branches of AI that have not yet articulated that could help everything from their manufacturing process, their operations, their gross operations, their marketing. There are so many different components that could truly benefit bottom line but also engagement with the consumer experience, which is a huge branch of contemporary marketing. That I'm curious to learn more about that, and we'll listen to more of your podcast to learn how people are thinking about that in different aspects. But I would say, Sri, as you said, AI is not going away. It's not a fad. It's not some trend that will, kind of wisp away. It is something that has to be addressed, that has to be addressed seriously, but has to be addressed not as something that is scary, but as something that is part of a business's discourse, an organization's discourse, and practice. Otherwise, that organization is essentially going to disappear. I mean, this sounds like, apocalyptic. I'm not trying to go there that way, but I'm just trying to be very kind of matter of fact. Like, look, you need to invest some resource, if not considerable resource, in this space. Otherwise, you may not be relevant anymore. And you won't know that you're not relevant until it's too late.
That is tremendous, James. Thank you. I want to remind our audience, please go and visit cpgguys.com. You can find all of our content. Our episodes are easily filterable by topics like natural language processing or retail media or AI. And if you think you or your company has some thought leadership to contribute to our ongoing community discussion, drop us an email at contact@cpgguys.com and maybe you can join us in a future episode of this podcast. Don't forget, when you're on the site or you're at Apple or Spotify, drop us a rating. At cpgguys.com, it's on the navigation bar at the top. But we really want to thank the 28,000 plus followers of us on LinkedIn who turn to the CPG Guys to be entertained and educated about this interesting business community that we find ourselves working in. James, thank you so much for taking time out of your day to talk to us about safety hazards and consumer advocacy. I learned an absolute treasure trove of knowledge out of today's conversation. Thank you so much for taking time.
Thank you so much for having me. This has been brilliant. I really enjoyed myself.
All right. Sri, I know you're going to say that this was a power-packed episode, so I'm just going to turn it over to you. What were some of the really glowing call-outs from today's conversation with James?
So right up top, when we started this episode, James mentioned guiding principle, which he's led his life by, is using science to do good. That's something we'd advocate everybody listening to do to this show. If you have a role to play in using science, leading with science, use it for the good of humanity. The moment he said one of the things he did was researching nanomaterials, my curiosity peaked in terms of learning what that means here on the CPG Guys. In his life, in college as a teacher, one of the things he prioritized was giving people techniques to learn, which was important to him. You teach someone to fish, to eat for life. Of course, I'm vegetarian, Peter, so that might not work in my case. But if you give someone a handout, it just gets harder. And I think giving people techniques to learn, there's some reality behind that. We also talked about his early work with the U.S. government, the Department of Energy, and then improving infrastructure. Infrastructure is what we lean as a backbone on every day. So the role of safety in that, I cannot emphasize even deeper. But we also discussed development of supercapacitors. And you kind of emphasize, for those who don't know, it's really about short bursts of energy in satellites. Another fascinating things, because every now and then I will look for pictures from the rover in Mars because I'm curious about, is there another world? I'm convinced there is. It's just because we can see only 3D and 4D, we assume there's nobody or nothing around us. Then we jumped into the basic consumer goods of every day. Like we asked you tell us about things that you remember from your past life that are either memorable or made profound impact. We talked about the Sturdy Act legislation to make dresses stable. We gave kudos to the K-12 educators for very early in life teaching children the early ABCs of how the world works. And boy, can I just take a minute here to double down on that. we want to create a future of humanity where understanding things on the basis of science, principles, and the basics of how things are built and they work is extremely important because it applies to everybody's real life and they get curious. And social media available now with so many versions of the truth that early education can perhaps contribute to judging the difference between right or wrong, at least heading in the right direction. Other memorable ones you kind of referred to was the focus on recalls and how important that is. So at the right time, things can be recalled versus recalled too late. And then pool safety. Fascinating to hear you listen to lifeguards sitting at the edge of pool and an intersection of the law of refraction. Not two words I would have ever intersected in my life until today. But now, the next time I'm at a pool, I will curiously be looking out for where the lifeguard sits, how close to the edge or not. Then we went on to if a tech can help you solve a problem, by all means proceed and even exploit it as required as long as it's helping you solve a challenge. You worked with advocacy organizations all your life and you called it very productive. A reminder that the advocacy of groups could be a focus, not just against things or like usually people assume these things are done to create barriers, but it's actually done for the future of humanity and for everybody's safety. To keep that kind of top of mind when people interact with these advocacy organizations. Then we talked about the cadence of reporting and testing, how important that is and the frequency of doing it, and that's what informs the decision making. And you gave the drones example, which is another fascinating one. And then we kind of wrapped up into the future where you talked about a handful of technologies kind of shaping the future. And we should be using these as part of our everyday business discourse and not treat it as scary and, oh my God, the world is changing and everything is going to fall apart. Those are image processing, the world of image processing that already exists today. I know personally it's helping me with my digital ID with Delta Airlines. It's made my life easier with global entry, TSA PreCheck, so many things. And then the world of natural language processing, which already exists today. And the big, big, big word, artificial intelligence. How did I do, James?
That's an amazing summary. And I didn't need to talk. You had everything right there.
Well, Sri, thank you as always. A very deft summary. I know that I was hoping to see you on television, catch a glimpse of you in your CPG Guys gear on the racetrack this weekend, but unfortunately the big race has been rained out. So I guess I will just wish you well because you have an upcoming trip to India to see family. So thank you for joining me as always, Sri, and to our audience. We're so grateful that you follow us. And we look forward to you joining us on the next episode of the CPG Guys podcast. Goodbye. The content in this podcast episode is provided for general informational purposes only. By listening to our episode, you understand that no information contained in this episode should be construed as advice from CPG Guys LLC or the individual author, hosts, or guests, nor is it intended to be a substitute for research on any subject matter. Reference to any specific product or entity does not constitute an endorsement or recommendation by CPG Guys LLC. The views expressed by guests are their own, and their appearance on the program does not imply an endorsement of them or any entity they represent. The views expressed by CPG Guys LLC do not represent the views of their employers or the entity they represent. CPG Guys LLC expressly disclaims any and all liability or responsibility for any direct, indirect, incidental, special, consequential, or other damages arising out of any individual's use of, reference to, or inability to use this podcast or the information we present in this podcast.